Hey everyone, it's Elliot here, and if this is your first time seeing my face, I am trying to read a book in every subgenre of every genre, starting with the fantasy genre. And the subgenre I am reading this time is low fantasy, and the book representing that is the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle by Haruki Murakami. I'm very excited for this one. But before we start talking about the book, like we always do, let's talk a bit about the genre, low fantasy. Previously, I talked about high fantasy and how high fantasy, the main definition of it is that it takes place in a world that is not our own. Like Middle Earth is high fantasy, Westeros is high fantasy. So if we think of it in reverse, low fantasy has to take place in the real world. It's magical elements, it's mythological creatures, all taking place in the real world. The thing where low fantasy can get a little blurry is when it starts off in the real world and then suddenly there's like a portal or there's like an underworld where the characters travel through and suddenly they're in another world. So it's like a blend between low and high fantasy. So for example, Narnia is, in my mind, high fantasy, but like they have to step through the wardrobe and stuff. So that is low fantasy. This is where it gets tricky, of course. Anyways, now I want to talk about Haruki Murakami. I've read a few of his works. Most notable is Norwegian Wood and After Dark, and I really enjoyed those two books. Norwegian Wood especially. I think that's the first book that I read from him and it really won me over. The last book that I attempted to read from Haruki Murakami is 1Q84, which is his massive, like it's over 900 pages. I just couldn't get through it. Maybe it wasn't the right book at the right time. I was also reading it on my tablet, which is not the best experience that I want when I'm reading. Anyways, I'm trailing off a bit and I really want to cleanse my palate with another Murakami book, so I'm pretty excited. I've only heard good things about it. In fact, people say it's one of his best work. I have really high expectations for this book, which pressure's on. You don't want me to give anything high expectations. I usually have really low expectations of stuff, and that way I'm never disappointed. I'll be very disappointed because it is a big book. I have to get through it. If it's another 1Q84 type of experience where I'm just trying to work my way, get through a chapter, and that would be a shame. I'm also looking for magical elements in this book. I assume it's going to take place in the modern world. The thing is, it's going to be set in Tokyo, I believe, which to me, Tokyo already feels like a fantasy world unto itself. So if you don't know the format to my book discussion, what I'm going to do is read to the middle, halfway point of the book. I'm going to check in with you guys once again, really literally after this in terms of video time. And then I'll check in once again when I completed the book, just so you get different perspectives. So my perspective at the beginning, we'll check back in the middle, and we'll conclude it at the end. Alright, this is Elliot Chan. See you momentarily. Wind-Up Bird Chronicles.
I'm back with the midway point, almost midway, not exactly yet, but I'm gonna do it now. How do I feel about the story so far? How am I feeling about it? I just want to say, Murakami is just so good at getting inside the characters' heads. The characters' thoughts are so vivid and clear, yet perplexing, because the circumstances itself just leaves the characters so confused. It's like their thoughts are clear, but the situation they're in is like really murky. Murakami is really good at just balancing the two, really creating great visuals, but also leaving you uncertain. One technique he does so masterfully is just leave little breadcrumbs of information. You know eventually you'll get all the details you need, but while you're on the journey, you're just getting a little bit. You're just being fed a little bit at a time, and which makes me think this is much less of a fantasy book than it is a mystery book. I wouldn't categorize this in a fantasy in any form at the moment. There really isn't a lot of fantasy to go on. Really isn't. It's very much a mystery book. The only elements that I could even consider fantasy at this point are there's a bit of prophesizing that's happening. Characters are insinuated to have special powers in some form in terms of prophesizing or having a unique knowledge about something, like the disappearance of a cat, for example. And there's a bit of, I guess, fantasy trope. It's not really a trope, but like a character going down a well is, to me, to me, what the story feels like so far is an interesting blend of confused stumbling about, getting this character being passed from one scenario to another, much like Franz Kafka's The Trial, and also this sort of lucid, dreamy, almost texture to it, much like an Alice's Adventure in Wonderland type of story, where every situation this character ends up stumbling into is kind of confusing. You're not sure what it's a metaphor for. For example, the story itself, I think the overarching theme is about a marriage and never being able to truly understand someone. I think that is the overarching theme. Then there's smaller stories layering it beneath. Another story is this World War II story where these group of soldiers get sort of, I don't want to spoil it, but they're out in the wilds of Mongolia and an event happens and you're just left thinking as a reader, is like, what does this have to do with everything else? One thing I talked about when I had the book discussion for Alice's Adventure in Wonderland is if you could leave enough mystery for the readers kind of come up with their own conclusion, or they want to try to figure out the riddle on their own. That is kind of what this book feels like. It's like a giant 1,000-piece puzzle. But let's see how this ends. Let's see if any more fantasy, being that the whole point of reading this book is to experience low fantasy. So I'm hoping there'll be more fantasy elements, and if I have missed a fantasy element and you have read this book before, please let me know what you consider to be a low fantasy element. Until then, I'm gonna finish reading this book and I'll talk to you guys real soon. Welcome back to the epic conclusion of my book discussion of the Wind-Up Bird Chronicles by Haruki Murakami. I just finished reading the book literally an hour ago. Still trying to process it all. It's a very complex book. A lot has happened within these 600 pages or so. Where do I even begin? I want to just maybe start by mentioning some of the magical elements that happen, because if you read this book just really literally, like just take everything literally, you would not think that it is fantasy at all. You wouldn't even think that there's any magical elements happening at all. And that is very deceptive of this book, because there are some magical elements. And I'm gonna just try to call out a few things. For one thing, the mark on his face that the main character gets, Toru Okada, I think that's his name. It's the narrator of the story. He gets a mark on his face, which is very similar to Harry Potter. He goes into this well and he stays there for, I think, a few days, and he comes out and essentially he has gone through a portal into another world, but a world that is still very similar. To me, that is a magical element. Another magical element are all the animals that sort of interact in the story. You have the cat, you have the wind-up bird, the bird that always winds up, and then you have the duck people at the end. By not being fully able to understand why these animals did what they did, they had sort of a mystery to them, a mythology to them. You could really tell that Murakami was really influenced by Franz Kafka because all the dreamlike sequence felt so kind of Kafka-esque. Like, he just goes through this thing, and then he has to do this thing, and then this thing needs to happen. He really captures that I'm about to go insane kind of feeling in this book that I get when I read Kafka books. And there is an underlying theme in the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, and that's the emasculation of men. So much of Japanese culture is based upon honor and standing up and being a man and all, and being noble. That could be hard to do sometimes. There are lines drawn, and as a man, you try to walk straight, but you're bound to stray. And every time you sway side to side, you end up kind of damaging your reputation in that way. And I think that's what Murakami is hinting at in this. It's every time you interact with someone, every time you do anything, you kind of become more of a man or become less of a man, in a sense. There's like a meter rating system to it. I also love how this book plays with formatting. It reminds me a lot of the David Mitchell book, Cloud Atlas. It's a movie, Cloud Atlas. It's told through different generations, but each generation, the format of the story is a little different. Like, one story is a letter, one story is a journal, one story is an interview. I kind of like that about the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, is that it does switch up format. It becomes a letter, it becomes like text on a screen at some point. I find that kind of fun, and it just reminded me of the different ways we communicate. This is indeed a very challenging book to get through for many reasons, mostly because it has been a very busy month for me, and I've just been trying to find time to get to it. And every time I pick it up, it's always like kind of jarring, like what is actually happening. It takes me a moment to kind of refocus, and a lot happens in this book. Before I finished the book, I thought that a lot would have been answered, but unfortunately, no. There's still a lot of questions I have about this book. Like, what does the well mean? Who is like the no-face man? Who did he beat up with a bat? Like, there's a lot of unanswered questions, but I'm gonna take a crack at answering them. I feel like there is a theme to the story, and I'm gonna just take a crack at it. Like fantasy, like understanding another human being, like understanding the world around you, you can never fully trust anyone or trust the world you see around you, because within everybody and within the world itself, there are wells inside all of us. There's wells within ourselves that we have to go down into. Unfortunately, we can't always go down into someone else's. I think that's it. I think that's the metaphor for the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle. Let me know what you think. I might be completely wrong. I might be completely right. A part of me wants to reread it so I could catch things, but a much bigger part of me is glad I'm done with this so I can move on to something else. This was an adventure. It wasn't fun the whole way through, but it was a trip. I don't think this one's my favorite. I still think Norwegian Wood is my favorite. It's nice, it's simple. I recommend that one before reading this one. So there you go. That is it. So once again, I am trying to read a book in every subgenre of every genre. If that interests you, follow me on this journey. If not, that's okay too. I hope to see you again soon. All the best. Bye.